Jennifer can come up, and hopefully your talk is better behaved. I see it's doing something. There we go. Okay.
Great, thank you.
You have the floor.
All right, well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. Steve Pine, you are a tough act to follow. And I don't have a crystal ball, so hopefully from the talk title that's presented in the workshop on the future of fire in the U.S., I'm going to give you some information and some perspectives from science about kind of our current, in the last couple of decades, impressions of fire in the U.S. And I think that that's a really important starting point for projecting and thinking about our future fire regimes. So really what I'm going to talk to you today about is the role of people in current and future fire in the U.S. And my background, just I'll put a little disclaimer here. I'm actually a natural scientist, a physical geographer, and a fire ecologist. And I've thought a lot about how fire works in systems, and throughout my career I keep coming back to people and the importance that people play in changing fire. And I think the question that we're left with right now in our scientific communities is this question of when is the deck stacked? When are we stacking the deck? When and where are hotter and drier conditions creating an opportunity for human ignitions to spread? And I'm going to keep coming back to this question, but I think it's one of the most important ones that we have to answer today. And what does science know? We know that fires are increasing in size and the numbers of fires are increasing as well. This is work from Phil Dennison and others. And essentially what it's showing is an imprint of fire across the U.S. using a record called the MTBS, or Monitoring Trends and Burn Severity Record. And each of those colored bars represents a different ecoregion. And in all ecoregions except for one, fire has increased. The number of fires has increased over the last couple of decades, starting with this analysis in 1984. And there's an important exception to that, which is Mediterranean California. And there's been actually a documented decline in fires in that region. And I think one also important question is, why is that? We also have evidence from a slightly different record showing that going back to the 1970s, the number of fires over 400 hectares starting in the 1970s and going to the present has been on the rise, and that's linked to two important phenomena. One is temperature anomalies, so that's what this black line is here, showing temperature anomalies in degrees Celsius over this same record. And also linking this to earlier springs. So every point that shows up in this pink part of this bar is demonstrating when we have an earlier spring onset. And that's also important in relation to what people are doing, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So as fire scientists, we like to think about this triangle of fire and the key ingredients: climate, fuels, and ignitions. And it's seemingly a simple recipe, but variations on those three ingredients are what give us endless complexity and interesting stories about how fire displays differently. And I'm going to go through each one of these and give you an impression of how people are changing each of those different ingredients. And the first one is climate. And there's been recent work that's shown that our contribution to climate warming has dried fuels and doubled the amount of western forests that have burned since 1984. So the explicit link to what people are doing is pretty clear at this point. And that's work that came out just a couple months ago by John Abotsoglu and Park Williams, and they looked at 8 different metrics of fuel aridity. So you don't really need to know what all these acronyms stand for, but it ranges from everything from the Palmer Drought Severity Index to vapor pressure deficit, which is a combination of temperature and relative humidity. And each of these 8 metrics, what they found was that anthropogenic climate change is drying our fuels. And so the delta change along the bar, the greater the change, the darker the color in red. And so what they found that since the 1970s, fuels have dried out by 50%, and that's attributed to anthropogenic climate warming. And then they linked that fuel aridity, changes in fuel aridity, to the amount of forest fire area that's burned, starting in the 1980s with these blue dots, and moving up this axis to present day to 2015. And what this is showing is that there's a stark increase in burned area related to specifically anthropogenic climate change and drying of fuels. Okay, so let me just back up a second here. So important to note that what we're doing with our climate is changing how fire is expressing on the landscape. So our second ingredient is fuels. And I could talk this entire talk and then some about how people have changed our fuel structures, but it relates from everything to thinning, to logging, to agriculture, road networks, fragmentation, but also invasive species. And I'm going to give you one example of how people are changing fuels through the introduction of invasives. So this is some work that I did looking at the role of cheatgrass, which is an invasive species. It burns twice as much as any native vegetation. And it covers an area, this is the Great Basin, this is Nevada, northern Nevada is where it's most prominent. It covers an area about 40,000 square kilometers. What I did was I matched that with the Modus burned area product to look at what's the relationship between cheatgrass and burning. And what we found was that cheatgrass burns twice as much as any native vegetation over a period of a decade, about 12% of that total land area burned. And that's compared with native sagebrush, pinyon juniper, alkali meadows, and other ecosystems. So this is a really important example of how people are also changing fuel structures. Here's a map of one of the largest fires you've never heard of from last year. This is the Hot Pot Fire in northern Nevada. It burned over 120,000 acres in a matter of a couple of days. And I just happened to have a graduate student out there sampling before that fire and after that fire. And what you see on the left is essentially a carpet of fuels that's dominated by cheatgrass. And so it was a fire that started through a lightning ignition, but it was carried a very long way through the influence of invasive grasses that essentially are filling the interspaces in between native vegetation. Okay, so ingredient number 3, ignitions. So in the US, over the last couple of decades, we've started 84% of our wildfires, which is a pretty remarkable number. And I think many folks have known that we start a lot of fires, but what we recently did was look at the human role of fire through the use of a US Forest Service sponsored database called the FPA-FOD, which Karen Short compiled. And this came out just a couple of weeks ago looking at how people are expanding fire's natural niche across the US. And the upshot of this paper is that, one, we start the large majority of fires. But even more important than that, and I think even more nuanced, and I'll get into why this is important, is that we are tripling the length of the fire season by providing ignitions when lightning doesn't. Our fire season is about 150 days a year, whereas the lightning-ignited fire season is about 50 days a year. Now, because of that influence, the wildfires that people start dominate an area 7 times greater than that affected by lightning fires, and we're responsible for nearly half of all of the area burned, 44%. So this record that we were basing our analysis off of is a record of over 1.5 million records of wildfires that were suppressed in the US over a 2-decade period. And in that database, there's information on cause. And so what we did was we looked at all of the fires that were started by people, and the majority are related to debris burning. Arson is a big one, heavy equipment use, campfires, children, smokers. These are all major categories in this cause information. And 1.3 million of those fires were started by people, and 260,000 were started by natural causes. This is the spatial distribution of that pattern across the US over this record of time. And again, this represents over 1.5 million records of wildfires, fires that required some sort of suppression response. And the percent of human ignitions increases as you increase in the red color and decreases as you move towards the blues. So what we have in the US over the last couple of decades is strong dominance by people in both the eastern US and in California, Mediterranean California. But the intermountain regions are really dominated by lightning-started fires. And there's important reasons for this. There's not only kind of where the spatial patterning of ignitions are from lightning, but also where people are living and how people are living and using those landscapes. And the boundaries here are ecoregion boundaries. And this is the lightning part of the story. So if we look at the natural lightning ignitions, and these are two plots from work that John Abatsoglu led and that I also contributed to. On the left, you have an image of density of dry lightning strikes. And on the right, you have the percentage of those total lightning strikes that are occurring as dry lightning with less than 2.5 millimeters of precipitation for the western US. And there's a couple of things I want to point out here. One is that California, Mediterranean California, looks like there's no data. But that's actually representative of the fact that there's not a lot of lightning strikes that happen in this region. And so because there's not a lot of lightning strikes, the opportunity for people to provide those ignitions is enormous. In California, you've got a system in Mediterranean California where 97% of the fires are started by people. Comparing that to, let's just go back one. So in this ecoregion, Mediterranean California, 97% of the fires are started by people. Next door in the Sierras, you actually have a very different story where only 34% of the fires are started by people. So again, looking at kind of what's the potential for people to change and shift fire regimes around, we have to understand what the natural sources of ignitions are. And so you've got high concentration of lightning strikes in the southwestern states, and the percentage of these that are occurring with dry conditions are highlighted in these red dots. So you've got a picture of kind of where fire is following dry lightning in these regions. And if we kind of pull that graph out and look at this, the temporal distribution or the seasonal distribution of fires, on the left is an image of the seasonal distribution of the human-started fires, and on the right is an image of the seasonal distribution of lightning-started fires. And the seasons follow this color scheme from winter being blue, spring being green, red being summer, and fall being orange. You see substantial, you see substantial spring burning going on in the eastern states, and later fall burning and summer burning going on in the western US, with a mix going on in the southeastern or middle south, Texas, Louisiana, where you've got also winter and a spring burning. And you compare that with what's going on in the lightning regime, and most of what's going on with lightning is happening during the summer months. And when we plot that out, the distribution of fires over the year, so starting in January 1st, December 31st, this is in Julian days, but the number of fires that are happening because of people is plotted in red, and the number of fires that are happening because of lightning is plotted in blue. And there's a couple really notable patterns here. This is representative of a lot of early spring burning going on in the eastern US. Can anybody tell me what this peak is? It's the 4th of July. So the single day across the year when we have the most human-started fires, or the most fires on any day, is because of July 4th. It's a shame that our Independence Day didn't happen to fall in the wintertime. But, you know, to speak to some of Steve's point about the importance of the cultural mark on fire, and fire being a cultural phenomenon, is really evident in this graph. And that we have to think about people and what people are doing. It is climate, it is fuels, but it's all of these things together. And so if we sum up what's going on in this graph in a couple of sentences, people are adding 850,000 fires when lightning strikes are rare, so in the shoulder seasons. In this part of the graph and in this part of the graph. And this summer distribution of lightning follows what we know from climatology and lightning climatology about when lightning strikes are happening. One really important point that I want to make here is that it's also not just about large, big fires. Even that notion of megafires enters into our science and the data that we're looking at. This captures every fire that's bigger than a hectare or an acre in size. But it's important to acknowledge that we don't just care about large fires. In fact, I live in Boulder, and just a few days ago we had the Sunshine Canyon fire, which threatened over 1,000 homes, and it was a fire that was less than a couple miles away from the town of Boulder. And that fire was 74 acres. Not very big, but because it was close to where people are living, and it was also started by people. It started at 1:30 in the morning. You don't get many lightning strikes at 1:30 in the morning in the middle of March. And it's important to think about how people are vulnerable to, but also contributing to our fire seasons. Okay, so splitting that graph out by ecoregion, just a couple of important things here. One, there is nuance, there is variety depending on where you are. And people play a bigger role or a lesser role, depending on where we are. This is Mediterranean California. So again, 97% of the fires that start in Mediterranean California are started by people. And compare that to the temperate Sierras, where only 34% of the wildfires that start are started by people. So again, there's this spread, there's this variety, and it's an important one. But even so, 34% is a lot of fires that are started by people in one of the regions that is less populated. There's also important variety and nuance when you look deeper into this data set. You see the evidence of road networks. So lightning-started fires are blue and red are from people. These are road networks where people are essentially starting fires alongside roads. You see important influences of where people are living. This middle figure is from Colorado. This is the Front Range going from Fort Collins, Boulder, Denver to Colorado Springs. So you do see very strong influence of people starting fires in these regions, to very stark ecoregion contrasts in the Appalachians. So this was a graph that we put together thinking about fire as a species, thinking about a species, almost an animal species or plant species that has criteria and environmental conditions under which it will exist. And we split out the lightning fires on the left and the human fires on the right and plotted essentially what we kind of determined were two of those important ingredients: ignition strikes from lightning on the left and fuel moisture, a metric of fuel moisture on the bottom. So plotting out all of the conditions in which fires happen, not surprisingly, the greater the number of lightning strikes that you get in a region and the drier conditions is where most of the fires sit for lightning. And what people are doing, and what we're demonstrating here, is that people are expanding that niche. We're burning during moister conditions and during times when you don't get lightning strikes. And so this bottom graph is showing the density or the number of fires plotted against fuel moisture for humans and lightning-started fires. And what you see is a big pulse of human-started fires between about 14% and 22% fuel moisture conditions. So we're providing the ignition source when fuels can carry fire, but they tend to be moister conditions. We also subsetted out the large fire events. These are fires that are over 400 hectares, and this is to compare with a lot of other fire science that has been focused on a record provided by MTBS that gives us information about large fires. And what we find, similarly, is that large fires are increasing over this period of time, this 2-decade period, and they're both increasing for lightning-started and human-started fires. And I think one of the questions here that's important for the fire science community to answer is, why is the human-started fires, why are they also increasing? Is it because of convergence with climate change and climate warming, and we just happen to be providing the ignitions that climate is then carrying into larger fires? Or is it related to the fact of where people are living and more people living in landscapes that can carry fires? You know, that's an important question for us to answer. And we also broke that down by season. So we looked at the large fires and their patterns of increasing over the spring, summer, and fall for both lightning and human-caused fires. And part of what's interesting here is that you see the, you see the increase in large lightning-started fires, mostly during the summer season. But with people, you see it both during the spring and during the summer. And that's important, going back to that second slide I showed about the early spring onset. If we do have early spring onset, is it lightning that's going to be providing those ignition sources, or is it people that are going to be providing those ignition sources for fires to start? Okay, so here's one of the questions that we have with us now is, what does the future of fire look like in the U.S.? Are we looking at more big and bad fires? And I want to put emphasis on the fact that not all fire is bad. We really do need to think about fire in terms of the good things that fire does and the good work that fire can do. And the message from that recent work is not that, oh, people are starting all the fires, Smokey the Bear was right, we need to put fires out. It's more, we need more of the right kinds of fires. And that work gives us justification for shifting how we're starting fires. Because people are providing the ignition source for 84% of our wildfires, anyways, we need to think about how we are setting those fires. And again, one of the key questions that we need to answer now is, how is climate change going to interact with people? And we've got some really good information that can help us answer this question, and this is also a research frontier. So 2 ingredients that we need. This is another version of that image of people and lightning-started fires. So on the left you have, in black, anthropogenic fires that were started over this period of time. And in red you have the lightning-started fires. Now we can now match this information with our understanding of how short-term fire danger is going to change because of a changing climate, and look at the intersection of people and climate. We also have really good information from some of the folks in this room about projections of future climate scenarios and how that will change future fire activity, going from the 2010 to 2030 all the way out to 2100. And this region that we're interested in today is obviously the United States, looking at likely increases in future fire activity into the future related to our climate variables. But we also have a good understanding of where people are living and projections of where people are going to live in the future. This is a picture of our WUI, the wildland-urban interface, where houses intermix with wildlands. In the yellows and the reds are the places where people are living in that type of landscape. And we know that today about 10% of our current land area is in this wildland-urban interface. And that's projected to double by 2030. And there are estimates that 80% of our potential wildland-urban interface is still undeveloped. So that's a really important number for thinking about what's going to happen in the future, and how people are going to be providing ignition sources, but also vulnerable to changing fire regimes. This is an image of the number of structures that were lost to wildfires between the 1990s and 2011, going up to the thousands. And again, people are vulnerable, but we're also providing the ignition sources for these fires. We are, in some sense, our own worst enemy in terms of creating vulnerable structures and vulnerable infrastructure that is then also vulnerable to the ignitions that we provide. So where is fire science going, and what are some of the messages that we have to share? One of them that's important is that we need to coexist with fire, that we need to live with fire and live more sustainably with fire. And 2 keys to that are how we build and how we burn. And the justification for this comes from, again, how close we're living to flammable places and flammable landscapes. This is from Headwater Economics. They put together a very nice image of the number of communities that had a 100-acre fire or greater within 10 miles of town. And it's over 4,000 communities today that are living with fire. And it really puts a point on our need for fire-wise communities, that there are better ways that we can build into flammable places. So one idea is taking floodplains to fireplanes, thinking about incentives for building and where we build. Looking at FEMA's floodplain maps, there's really no reason why on a national scale that shouldn't exist for fire as well, and thinking about fireplain maps. And California has really been a leader in this work, putting together what they call fire hazard severity zones to help insurance and to help think about our building into some of these landscapes. And we have good information that can help us provide justification for those types of maps, such as from the Cohesive Wildland Fire Management reports, where they come up with fire regime groups and frequent to moderate frequency and also severity metrics. And we have justification now for doing more of the right kinds of fires. And this is from the Prescribed Fire Council. And in 2014, they treated over 47,000 square kilometers, or roughly 12 million acres. And for one final point, I want to highlight some work that was done by Rebecca Bird and others in Western Australia. And getting to Dar's question about, under a changing climate, how do we anticipate and change what our future fire patterns are going to look like? How are we going to adapt? And I think some important lessons come from communities around the world who are practicing patchwork mosaic burning and using patchwork burning as a mechanism to reduce the risk of large climate-driven fires. And this is, again, kind of justification for doing more of the right kinds of fire and using prescribed fire as a tool rather than treating it as a threat. And let me just briefly walk through this map. So we're in Western Australia. This is the Martu indigenous communities. A picture of their road networks, their pathways, and some of their towns or villages are these little white dots right here. And you could imagine that this could be anywhere with road networks and towns. And the different colored swatches are essentially different burns that have happened at different periods in time. And some of the earlier burns are in the darker reds, and some of the more recent burns are in yellow. And what this is showing is kind of the burning pattern that happens close to communities is here. And the burning pattern that happens further away, that's lightning driven, is here. And here's another subset image of that. So lightning driven fires have these larger patches, larger burns, and more managed burn systems from Aboriginal hunting fires are much, much smaller. And effectively what this community is doing, and the important lesson is that they're mitigating the risk of these large climate-driven fires through their use of fire. And it's an old lesson, and it's something that we keep coming back to in light burning, our prescribed burning regimes, but institutionally it's very difficult for us to create the type of distributed network of burning that happens through communities, from little children that are burning to grandmothers that are burning to hunting burns, to having that incorporated back into our life cycle. I mean, can you imagine us all leaving here today and going out and setting some burns, just because we need to manage our landscapes? It just sounds atrocious. But that's an implicit and explicit part of Aboriginal burning and also indigenous burning practices around the world. So briefly, I want to talk about the role that we have as scientists in the power of big fire data. And I like to call this a modern-day palimpsest. Thanks to Steve Pine for highlighting this a number of years ago. And a palimpsest is a manuscript page from a scroll or book that the text has been scraped off and washed off so that it can be used again. And this is an important metaphor for a couple of reasons. One, we have a landscape that is a living palimpsest that has imprints and memory from our use of the landscape and from using fire and from fire being part of that landscape. But it's also an important metaphor in that today, as a fire scientist, it's a really exciting time because we have a lot of information and we have a lot of data from different sources that can help us answer these really important questions. Going back to fire in the US from the 1880 census and a vision of fire that's very different from what we have today, to using incredibly powerful visualization tools for looking at our fire landscape. This is a screenshot of a compilation of fire data. The blue and the orange circles or squares are data from MODIS active fire detections and VIIRS active fire detections. And what we've done is also match that with Digital Globe, a private company that has the highest resolution imagery in the world, privately held imagery in the world, and overlay that on top of their shortwave infrared, which is 6-meter resolution. And you can see this fire line actively happening through that imagery. And we also have really novel sources of information, so we can apply machine learning techniques and text analysis or natural language processing to forms like incident reports from different agencies and actually mine that information for novel insights. And we also have new sources of information like drones that as scientists we're really excited about being able to finally understand ecosystem processes at this scale. And also social media data. So this is a picture of the number of searches that entered in wildfires into Google in 2015 to understand social responses to wildfires as well. So 3 major points. We need to think about reframing fire from myths to realities. People play a fundamental role in changing our fire in concert with climate and fuels. Not all fire is bad. Fire does good work. And we can and must live with fire by building better and burning better. So, thank you.